thank you all for joining. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director at Transform Finance. And with the rest of the team, I've been working on this issue of shifting power, governance, and decision-making to communities in the investment context for quite a while. And of course, one of the big aspects of this work has been seeing which type of capital providers and intermediaries are involved or are interested in looking at grassroots community engagement from this lens of wealth building, closing the racial wealth gap, power building, and moving towards economic democracy. So I am delighted that today I am joined by three fabulous speakers that have been very active in the space. We have Leslie Lindo from the Olamina Fund at Candide Group, Sondra Ford with the Low Income Investment Fund, and Nate Schaffran from Community Vision, that some of you might have known by its previous name of the Northern California Community Loan Fund. So I'm very excited to have them give us a bit of an orientation to how they view the role of CDFIs, what their particular institutions have been doing in this space, and what we all as a field might do in order to foster the engagement of CDFIs with communities. Let's start with a quick recap because this is our fifth session of the discussion series based on the report that we issued back in March, April. So let's take a very quick look first at what we mean by GCEI projects by looking at some of the differences between the grassroots community engaged ones and the ones that don't have grassroots community engagement. Many of which, as always, big disclaimer, can be terrific projects, can do good things, but as we analyzed in our work and in the report, oftentimes they miss that extra something, either in terms of impact that is left on the table or opportunity to further align with a mission and with a theory around building more equitable communities. So generally in the goals in GCEI projects, we see a combination of building wealth for the communities, but also building power, whether it is in terms of agency and self-determination or actual political power. The decision-making is often made by grassroots or by their representatives. And sometimes people are still surprised at this. We actually mean decisions over investments, not just consultation, not just some sort of voice, but actually getting to having a governance role. And the vision comes from the communities themselves. It's tied to their priorities, to their aspirations, as opposed to being an outsider that says, oh, I have a vision for this community and I can provide the capital. There is a strong focus on process. Process itself is part of the outcome. The very process of engaging folks, of having them understand the role that they can play, of having them feel like their voice matters is one of the outcomes here as a focus. And in some cases, as we've seen, which is probably one of the more rare ones, the participation in the investment process and the community investment process is seen as a political act, as an act again of self-determination of economic democracy. And from more practical stance, the wealth building that comes from these investments, as Transfer Finance, we always talk about the leakage or making sure that investments create more value locally than what is taken out by investors. There is a strong element here of local wealth building, or a strong emphasis on making sure that the value that is being created financially remains with the community. A few more things, there are opportunities in GCEI projects for residents to invest or to become part owners of the projects, oftentimes in a way that is de-risked by outside parties. Virtually all of them have shown an explicit racial justice lens to the work, even though in theory one could have grassroots community engaged projects even without a racial justice aspect to it in communities, let's say, that there are less diverse. There is an aspiration also to build some of the technical capacity within the community itself, so that it becomes over time less dependent on outside expertise over investment structures and the like. And again, as part of the process, there is both accountability from the outside investors, so I need to be responsive to the results in the community, not just experimenting at the expense of communities. There is buy-in from the community by virtue very much of their participation, and this ties directly to the success of the project, but also again to its alignment, right? If you're saying that you're doing something for the community, having its buy-in seems pretty important. And this element, of course, of grassroots involvement in the initiation and the design and in the governance of the projects. Now, today we're speaking specifically about CDFIs. So there are a few ways in which CDFIs can engage or can engage with the communities. We've seen some instances of advisory boards from the community that could be grassroots representatives or multiple stakeholders. In some cases, there are strong governance provisions, actually not just a voice, but also a vote or even veto power over certain investments, or an oversight role where the community representatives actually hire the CDFI, and the CDFI is serving at the pleasure of these groups and is fully accountable to them. So there's I highlight this bit of variety here because we do see this very much as a spectrum, as a continuum, where one might start with some engagement like an advisory board and then give it governance power over time, or where a governing board might expand over time to include more of the community voices. And in terms of the roles that the CDFIs play. Now, stepping back for a second, historically, CDFIs, right, by definition, are engaged in community development. But as the industry has grown, as our colleague Cliff Rosenthal highlighted in his book on democratizing CDFIs, the professionalization and growth of the space has also disconnected CDFIs sometimes from some of the aspects that we were talking about before. But there are some efforts that need to be highlighted, such as the ones that we'll be talking about today. And there seems to be, I hope, I believe, an increasing willingness on the part of more CDFIs to engage in some of these roles, either as conveners and initiators of GCEI projects, or as core partners playing the underwriting role on behalf of the community, or as providers of capital to CDFIs with a grassroots community engaged investment lens, or otherwise, as providers of capital in the ways that are consistent with the community needs. Now, I am not the expert on all of this, and that's why we have three fantastic speakers joining us today for this. As I mentioned, for those that are just joining us now, we have Leslie Lindo from the Olamina Fund at Candide Group, Sondra Ford at LIFT, the Low Income Investment Fund, and Nate Schaffran from Community Vision. So with that, I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to them. We'll spotlight them so that you can see them as they join the conversation. So Leslie, Nate, Sondra, thank you so much for joining us today and for being willing to share with us a little bit of your experience and your views, on this grassroots community engaged approach to investments. So let's start with you, Leslie. Maybe do you want to tell us a little bit about how your work fits in this general context, what you do at the Olamina Fund?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having us here and for facilitating this conversation. The Olamina Fund is a loan fund initiative at Candide Group, and we are centered on racial and economic justice. And we're really focused on creating access to capital in communities that have experienced historic extraction and exclusion from the economy. And we primarily lend to communities in the Deep South, Native communities, as well as rural America. And I would say that, we really are focused on shifting the power dynamics that exist traditionally in our financial system. And part of our demonstration of that was in our intentional design to create a community advisory board that governs our fund and participates in our credit decisions. And our community advisory board is representative of the communities where we lend.
I still haven't learned how to take myself off of mute, but I seem to have mastered it right now. Nate, Sondra, either of you?
Okay, I'm happy to go next. Thank you. Thank you for having us. This is a great conversation that honestly, I don't think I ever tire of being part of. By way of introduction, I work for Low Income Investment Fund, but I'm really here in part because I represent Low Income Investment Fund on the SPARK initiative, Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. It's, I think, complicated, just like the subject is complicated. And we are 3 national organizations who work with 4 national philanthropic organizations in 6 geographic locations to do a lot of things that Leslie talked about, to find ways to have successes and learnings about how we do a better job of making sure that communities are part of the decisions that are made for them in terms of what their communities are going to look like, to give them more power, more access, more funding, more voice. And we're working specifically in 6 communities around the country that we're hopeful. We're in the 5th year of a 6-year funding, and we're just hopeful, honestly, that we'll be able to share and help others find ways to move their goals forward. Everybody's community is a little different, we recognize that, but some of the problems and then some of the solutions have similar threads, and we're hopeful that when we end our partnerships, we will have a lot of learnings and successes to share that will move not just our geographies forward, but others as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sondra.
And hi, everyone. My name is Nate. I'm the co-director of Lending at Community Vision. We're a almost 35-year-old nonprofit community loan fund and federally certified CDFI, and we're contracted as the fund administrator of the Real People's Fund. And we'll talk more about what that means.
Great. Since we're so concise, Nate, maybe we can keep you on the spot there. Yeah, tell us a little bit about why it is that Community Vision decided to engage in this process. As I understand, you play a vital role in the context of the Real People's Fund, which we featured in our report, and is one of the, generally considered to be one of the more innovative projects in terms of real distributed community governance through representative local community groups. Yeah, what was it that led Community Vision to do this as opposed to others that have not?
Yeah, so the Real People's Fund was conceived of by a collaborative of 6 grassroots community organizing groups in the East. And these are base building groups that mobilize low-income residents of specific neighborhoods, mostly historic communities of color, to advocate for change around issues that directly affect them. And at the time, what they were really responding to was seeing their neighborhoods and communities kind of hollowed out by gentrification, the pressures of rising living costs, really affecting a lot of the historically realized that they needed an economic power building strategy to complement their political power building. So this fund really is about fundamentally shifting power. And the first aspect of that is shifting power over who gets to decide how money flows into low-income communities. And as Andrea said, and as Transform Finance has highlighted in its excellent report and in this series, this is all about actually allowing low-income communities and the organizations that represent them to have a say, and maybe even the final say, in how money moves into their community. And when they put out an RFP for a fund manager, that's kind of been our objective as well as Community Vision, is to find ways that we could incorporate community voice. But this went a step further, and to say, this is not bringing a community voice into our organization, but putting our organization, our platform, our experience, our staff at the service of organized low-income communities. And we'll talk more about how that's organized in practice day to day.
Great, thank you, Nate. And I'll let you know, you were breaking up a little bit, but I'm hopeful that everybody managed to follow still. Leslie, let's go back to you then for a moment, because of the uniqueness also of what the Olamina Fund has been doing, and maybe you can share with us how it is that that it came to be, why again you took this this approach that others have not taken, and where you see this going.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say, it's really fun to be here and hear about the Real People's Fund. Particularly, Andrea, you and I remember being at the very early stages of working groups for that. So it's an incredible project. So the Olamina Fund, again, comes out of Candide Group, which is an impact investing firm. And broadly speaking, we focus on social and environmental justice issues. And the Olamina Fund was really a way to focus on the racial and economic injustices in the country. And as we were designing the fund, we really went around and had a listening tour from community leaders of what was really needed, where we were seeing the biggest gaps in access to capital, and what's really contributing to the racial wealth divide that we see. And all of that work, most of that work was really done by Lynn Hoy, who had joined Candide Group from RSF Social Finance and is now with the Candide Foundation. And, you know, and part of that listening, we really learned about the work that CDFIs are doing in the community, how they're really representative of the folks and come out of the civil rights movement. And many are constrained because they themselves lack an access to capital and are therefore restricted in the types of lending that they can do, and how they could be really innovative to support the communities that they serve. And so, we, you know, we're really intentional about wanting to support CDFIs as well as other nonprofit community loan funds. And what we look for when we're investing in them are organizations whose leadership and decision-making body is representative of the communities that they serve. And, you know, as we're doing our evaluation, we're really looking at the ways that they're connecting with and engaging with the community as they're designing their programs and products, making sure that it is addressing the needs of that community and that they have that level of accountability, again, with the folks that they're serving. So that's, you know, that's something that's really important to us. And we're also really looking at seeing how the products support community wealth building as one of our tenants. And you know, as I said earlier, part of our original design was to have this community advisory board that we developed and put together within the first year, knowing that, one, we wanted to work with CDFIs because they're in the communities, they're on the ground working with these grassroots communities. But as we're kind of, here in California, we're detached from what's going on the ground. And so having a body that can provide some governance and decision-making and contribute to our strategy again, as well as the final say on who we're lending to. We really wanted that to be a representative body of the folks in the communities where we lend.
Thank you, Leslie. And I imagine to all on this call or in this conversation, that makes a lot of sense intuitively and in terms of values, but also it sounds much more complicated than business as usual. It put in some additional layers of work, and which doesn't mean it ought not to be done. I mean, that's why we're here, right? To explore a little bit how to deal with that and the richness that comes from these processes. And Sondra, I know that Spark has been quite intentional around the learnings and the evaluation from the first phase and pivoting as needed in response to the need for this community engagement. Could you share a little bit with us about that as well? And then Nate, maybe you can tell us how the process has worked for you all and what you all have learned.
Yes, so you mentioned, thank you, that we are in the second phase of what is a 6-year commitment from our foundation partners, and you asked about learnings and successes. And so all of those things are incredibly important. I look every day at a quote that for some reason fell off of my wall that says that something like all systems are work exactly as they are created to. And so it's just so important that we recognize that in order to make the changes that we want to see, we have to have some disruptions in the things, in fact, a lot of disruptions in the things, in the way that things have been done. And, you're mentioning Leslie's program and that it feels like a lot more work than maybe we typically do in CDFIs to get things accomplished. It's become clear to us in Spark that there are a number of things that need to go on in communities. Money is certainly one of the big important areas that they need more of. But we're also looking at change in other ways. We're looking at climate change. We're looking at changes in the way that we think about health. And we're looking at all of those things with a racial equity lens. Because one of the things that I think we didn't know going into this 5 years ago is what everyone now understands with the racial reckoning that we went through last year and with COVID and what COVID has bared in terms of our country and the inequities. That if we aren't honest and clear about the fact that race plays a part in all of this, then we're not going to be on the road to solving all of the difficult issues that we're here to try to solve. In terms of learnings and successes, I think we find some every week. I would say that the way that we find them is, as someone mentioned, listening. We've learned how important, how critical listening to what our geographies are saying, what they're saying they need, and quite frankly, what they're saying they don't need is key in our ability to provide assistance to them and for them so that the communities that they live in move in the directions that they want them to.
And yeah, I can also speak a little bit to some of the learnings. So, you know, our biggest learnings, I think, have to do with what it really takes to implement structures where power is shared in non-traditional ways. I think that's the theme of so much of this grassroots community investment work is to actually follow through on the ideas of shifting power means that at every step along the way, the process is going to be different from what you're used to. The power relationships will be different than what you're used to. So, you know, an example that is at the root of everything that we've done is we made an initial design choice not to have the financial intermediaries ourselves represented on the board. So the board consists solely of representatives of the 6 grassroots community organizations that conceived of the fund. Community Vision and our partner Runway, who I'll talk more about in a second. We're service providers. We're contracted. We can be terminated. You know, we serve at the pleasure of the community organizers who conceived of this. And so it's not, you know, it's sort of, I think, an important step beyond the advisory panel where we could receive community input and then take it or leave it. It's really the community that calls the shots. So that sounds great, but I find that potential investors are sometimes thrown off by the implications of that in reality. So, you know, folks come for the idea of community control and then they start asking questions about, you know, what's the track record of the board members in managing funds? None, you know. And the real expertise that they have, and the reason that people should feel comfortable investing, is that they have deep expertise in community needs. They understand the community concerns because their jobs day in and day out are to be out speaking to residents, organizing residents, and addressing problems. And what I think this kind of does is it inverts the sort of hierarchy of what we think is important. In sort of traditional community capital, we think hard credit skills are important and understanding of impact is, you know, either a secondary concern or it's assumed that it's there. And our approach says understanding of community needs and impact is the most important thing, and the board can contract with experienced specialists like ourselves in Runway to provide credit. So that's powerful. What I think it means in practice is we then have a responsibility to co-educate and co-design with our community board members, right? So at every step along the way, we don't just, you know, for example, we made a decision that loans would not go through Community Vision and Runway's existing credit committees. We would establish credit committees that have representation from the community groups, whether the board members or people that they appoint. And then we can't just say, you know, who from the community wants to be on the credit committee? We've had multiple sessions where we talk about what goes into a credit memo. What are you going to be reading and reviewing? What kind of factors should you weigh? What are credit risks? The same goes for developing a budget, for creating investment documents, for determining our loan products. You know, at each of those stages, it's collaborative and educational co-design.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate all that you brought up, both Sondra and Nate. And if we can move for a second then to the CDFI field at large. You mentioned, Nate, the difficulty on the part of investors or capital providers to the CDFIs and wrapping their head around this. What are some of the obstacles, including that one or others that have come up? What are some of the patterns that CDFIs have had a hard time breaking? We've heard about, you know, the timeline issues, that this can take longer. The size of the projects might be smaller, the lack of track record. Are those real obstacles? Is that what's holding the rest of the CDFI industry back a little bit? And how can they be tackled? For any of you.
You know, I would say for us, this didn't require a culture change so much as it was the sort of opportunity we had been looking for. You know, we had already entered into a strategic plan that put racial and economic equity at the forefront. And we have been seeking opportunities to sort of not share power rather than hoarding it, and to use our sort of status as an established incumbent CDFI, benefiting from things like the CDFI fund and the investment that we receive from banks through the CRA to kind of reach out to grassroots community groups. So one thing I think is that CDFIs, have a platform. We think of ourselves often as the little guys, relative to the banking world. But when it comes to grassroots community investment, we, LIF, other organizations, LISC, a lot of our peer CDFIs, these are CDFIs with balance sheets in the hundreds of millions of dollars and with 20, 30, 40-year track records. So we can sort of provide a platform, and I think putting that platform in the service of community initiatives, whether that's actually being a back office as we're doing as Community Vision, closing and servicing loans and providing treasury management. That was a decision that the community groups made, is they wanted to direct investments, but they were not trying to build the loan fund, and that wouldn't have been efficient or reasonable, right? So I think being willing to sort of take our tool and put it at the service of community, where we give up a little bit of control. And I think maybe the biggest thing is being comfortable with devoting staff time to that, sort of as there's some opportunity cost that we could be doing something that might perhaps be, a higher financial return. But this was pretty clear that this was sort of the highest impact opportunity that we had.
Yeah, I can just say quickly from the CDFIs that we tend to lend to, we find that either they don't have access to other investment capital, particularly private investment. It's difficult to get funding from traditional banking institutions, and they're heavily dependent on grant awards from the CDFI fund or other grants from foundations or federal or state grants, and most of those are very restrictive, and so they don't really actually have the flexibility to create the types of products that specifically meet the needs of the communities that they're serving. And so part of when we're coming in investing is making sure that it is unrestricted and that we're giving them as much flexibility as possible so that they can do what's needed, so that they can meet and design the solutions that they're developing with their community.
Just to add to that, and I feel like everything that I'm hearing from both Nate and Leslie are things that Spark has thought about, and LIF have thought about in one way or another. But just I want to kind of highlight an idea that Nate brought to my mind. And I think for Spark and for LIF too, you have to prioritize. I mean, you just can't have everything be at the same priority, or the things that you have said that you want to do are not going to happen in the way that you want them to. And so we've thought about how we look at some of the priorities that we have. And if I were to order them, I would, if we're really serious about getting to where we want to be, it would be community in listening and understanding what it is the communities want, what they need from us, how we can be of assistance, rather than what we typically have done is to provide them a product that if they can use it, and if they can't, then it's something that we can't help them with. So community is number one. The second is capacity. The capacity of the communities that we're interested in serving. As Nate talked about the communities that he's working with, and they let his organization know these are the things where we don't have capacity and where we need you to be helpful to us. And then if you put capital last, and it kind of bubbles up into the priorities that you have said that you have in terms of capital and community, then you can find ways to make the capital And of course, it's not that simple, but you can find ways to make the capital serve the capacity that the communities have told you that they need and the communities that you've said you want to serve.
Great. Thank you all. And I want to make sure one of you sees Melanie Beth's question in the chat if you'd like to address it. And meanwhile, then one follow-up from what you all were saying. So there is a moment now with this interest from philanthropic funders to think about power, decolonize their practices, reckon with their past and their present. There is a push from communities to claim or reclaim the power and agency over them. So do you see a similar willingness on the part of CDFIs at large to reckon with this and to make moves in this direction? You've talked about how it can be done and some of the challenges of it. Do you feel like the field is actually moving? And what would it take? What can we, the folks on the call, do to get us there?
Yeah, I can speak to probably the latter part, your last question, Andrea, just from, one of the things that we're looking at the Olamina Fund. When we are first evaluating the organizations that we're lending to, we lead with an impact questionnaire. So seeing how they're aligned with our impact thesis. And from there, we kind of make the decision about whether or not we want to move forward. And, during last year, with the racial reckoning, we found that a lot of investors were really interested in investing in the Olamina Fund. It was, kind of a safe way to say that, oh, hey, I'm investing in racial justice. And so, it really stood out to us that it's as important to us that we are partnering with investors who understand this work from a very authentic place and are invested in it and doing it and are rethinking the traditional paradigms around risk and return. And so decided that we wanted to develop an impact questionnaire for prospective investors as well. And that is something that, again, our community advisory board would be participating in to determine, is this investor the right partner for the work that we want to do in Olamina, particularly as we're kind of thinking about the next phase of the fund. And so that's something that, for us in particular, for the community advisory board to say, hey, we're going to evaluate you, investor, and, see if we want, to partner with you, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're not bringing in folks who are going to cause harm in the communities that we're serving.
Yeah, I'd be happy to try to address the question from Melanie. Such a good question. The systems that need to change. And what you're asking is right in the eye of some of the issues that we knew that we would face going into this work. Appraisals. I mean, that's a big elephant in every room that has anything to do with real estate. And so there are folks that I know of that are trying to find ways to work around appraisals, on how you look at them and how what we expect the appraiser to take into consideration. To my knowledge, I don't know of anyone who has found a way specifically to have an appraisal reflect value in a way that's different from what we've traditionally done. So now we have to find ways to work around that, right? So I think the things that we're doing are probably not particularly surprising to anyone. We're working with low interest loans. We're working with capital grants. in the way that communities tell us they need them, whether there'll be permanent subsidy in the project or whether they will be revolving grants that come back and we're able to then grant others. So it's just trying to be creative and thoughtful. Again, listen to what the communities are saying that they need. And just specifically on the guarantees, we're fortunate to have had a foundation who provided us with a guarantee, which is incredibly helpful, but it is limited. It provides help, typically, we like to say, for maybe one issue. So if the issue is that the appraisal value doesn't give us what we need, and we're at 120% loan to value and we need to be at 100%, then the guarantee may help us with that. But if we've got multiple issues that we're trying to work with, an appraisal, and then in addition to that, cash flow issues, that becomes more of a challenge. And so we work toward trying to solve or resolve each issue as it comes up. In some cases, not surprisingly, we're more successful than we are in others. But again, listening, patience, creativity are all tools that we use in addition to the low interest and the grants and the guarantee.
Thank you both very much for that. Great. So let's see, as we bring in some more of the questions.
I'd be happy to speak to Ada's question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please do.
So it's a great question, Ada. The question was about capacity building and finding the business opportunities. And you mentioned that you're in a struggling former coal mining region. You know, we were clear about that from the beginning. And really, I shouldn't say we, I should say our partners, Runway and Optima Entrepreneurship Cooperative. So from the start, capacity building has been built in. We work with an organization called Optima Entrepreneurship Cooperative that is, as far as I know, the only cooperatively owned business developer in the country. And I encourage you all to go on their website and learn more about their offerings. I think it's a really high quality, culturally relevant business advising curriculum that includes sort of group classes and peer support. There's a peer learning circle for small business owners to meet with other small business owners. And I think that's been important both from a sharing learnings and kind of emotional support. Then there's one-on-one counseling, and it actually continues through the life of the loan. So it starts off, there's these peer support circles and then one-on-one counseling that is initially weekly and then becomes less frequent over the course of the loan, but maintains those touch points. And I think that's important. And you asked a little bit about at what level. We're raising $1 million towards a $10 million loan fund. So that's, sort of 10% of the capital deployed going towards technical assistance. And circling back to the question about participatory design and new ways of doing things, that sort of ethos really suffuses the way that particularly our partner Runway does their work. And so a learning for me and an example of doing things differently, Runway and now the Real People's Fund structure their credit committees in such a way as to invite in the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur, potential borrower, actually comes and sits in the room when their loan is being discussed. For me, that was a crazy idea, right? Because my training is, this is where all of the hard-headed numbers people get in and tear it apart and find all the reasons it's not going to work. And Runway, who really sort of are built from the ground up to support Black entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color, often who are just getting started and for whom this is their first interface with a financial institution, take the view that you can actually use this as a capacity building opportunity to be transparent with the entrepreneur and say, here are the things that we think are strengths about your proposal. here are some things where, we have concerns, and let's talk about what we can do to support you through them. And that was, a very different way of doing business for us as a CDFI, but I think a good example of designing with the community in mind.
Thank you. And by the way, yeah, please do pick up on whichever questions come through as you see fit. And I see there is one from Natalie directed at Nate. And I do want to make sure that we leave some time to think about what do you all need as support. Right? This requires more capacity, more probably grant funding, longer timelines, and both for you all and for the communities that you serve, and that is not always something that is easily available, and it's precious, scarce dollars that need to be allocated properly. So I want to make sure that we touch on that, and we can brainstorm with others on the line, what these needs are. But if you want to pick up either Devin's question or Natalie's question, I see that Leslie already responded to Devin in the chat. You're way ahead of me. And Devin, I would also encourage you to jump in if you want to share any comments live on the line. I want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you have a lot that you could share, and your work has informed a lot of what we have learned about the role of CDFIs in this.
The only thing that I might add, I think has been covered pretty well already, is just sort of the way that our process has been pretty staff intensive in terms of spending sometimes years with folks that are trying to sort of figure out how to make the deal side work so you can then make the capital side work, and being in partnership with them, and how much that's really a different model than sort of essentially kind of triaging and looking for deals that fit your product and trying to deploy capital in more of a one-way flow. So just thinking about the ways to sustain that and to fund that in ways that will never be entirely supported by fees on these projects or anything like that.
Thank you, Devin. And while we have it, can I ask you one other quick thing, since you're there and on camera? Because you have shared before, which I found very useful and enlightening, some of the different types of staff that are within CDFIs, right? They're the ones that are doing more of the community-facing or kind of field building work, and the ones that are doing actual underwriting. Can you share with the group at large some of your considerations on that? Like, who is in a position to do what, and how a CDFI can think through it?
Yeah, I think that the conversations you're referencing are how, that for a lot of CDFIs, there's sort of a lending shop that is really kind of a nuts and bolts sort of financial practice. And then there's sort of a program side of the house where folks sometimes have, I know that Community Vision has sort of a fee-for-service consulting shop. There are other parts of organizations that are built around that. And what we're finding in our work at Spark is that we, as program staff, often need to get very close to that line, that organizational silo, to really try and have those conversations and understand perceived risks, and really not quite become lenders, but as close as we can, in terms of really build that synergy across silos, and finding ways to sort of lift that up within the organization and continue to build on that practice is part of what's coming out of Spark as a kind of a lesson learned for us, and ways to think about how to, again, sort of resource that. But often when folks say CDFIs, it's often kind of broadly applied, and sometimes we have to describe that, we don't sit in the lending chairs, we're in program chairs to support you, and sometimes that nuance is lost, particularly when with under one logo you have a lot of different functions, and folks kind of engage with your organization with different starting points.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Sorry for putting you on the spot. And it actually seems reminiscent of the dynamic that foundations are seeing with coming closer to that wall between the grant making side and the investment side of the house, and in some cases trying to integrate it a little bit better. Let's pick up Paul Bradley's question then on the lack of community engagement as a risk. Yeah, Nate, I'll turn it to you on that. We have seen it talked about as a de-risking mechanism, right? The community engagement, but is there a risk, yeah, from not doing it? So.
Yeah, I'll say this quickly, but I saw Paul's question. I wanted to speak to that. You know, in our case, we didn't try to create a new community group or a new community convening. The idea was there are existing, long-standing, deeply rooted community organizations that have been for 20 or 30 or 40 years working with low-income communities. They have a broad membership base. They are themselves democratically organized, and they have earned through painstaking efforts of campaigns over the years the trust of their members, and they really value it. And so they sort of function as the representatives, and we're, you know, we sort of exist almost as a representative democracy to move capital, right? Where the people on our board are appointed through these membership organizations, but they'll often say in one of our meetings, I'm gonna have to take this back to my membership before we decide. So that's helpful. There is a flip side, getting back to this theme of it all takes longer to do this in a participatory way. You know, over this last year, our board members, because they are full-time community organizers, have been really called on to dig in response to the twin pandemics. So, you know, our board chair has been leading, is a criminal justice reform advocate and herself a formerly incarcerated youth who has been leading the effort to get people in the Alameda County Jail decarcerated in the midst of a COVID outbreak there, and also to shift budget resources at the county level towards youth programming from law enforcement. Our board president leads an organization that is based in Oakland, Chinatown. It's kind of been at the forefront of responding to the attacks on Asian elders, and, you know, has been organizing voluntary community patrols and community vigils. And so these people, you know, those are the real day-to-day demands on their time that they have to balance with things like reviewing investment documents for a fund.
Yeah, and I'll add quickly, I know we're getting short on time, but you know, on the de-risking piece, I mean, really, when you're engaged with the community, when you have the leadership that is, you know, on the ground, and you're building those relationships, and the centering relationships and building that level of trust is really, you know, where you're going to see that risk minimized. I mean, you know, if you look at the rate of repayment on these loans, you know, it far exceeds what we see in the traditional banking system. And I really do think that, you know, that is centered on, you know, on the relationships. And, you know, OISTA is a really great example, you know, of their longstanding. I think they've had like one loan that's defaulted, and, you know, in their entire existence. So, you know, so really that's, you know, when you have folks that are connected to the community, you know, as Nate is talking about, these folks are going to kind of show up with you and be a partner with you. And that in of itself is, you know, de-risking that investment.
And I'd just like to add, Nate mentioned early on that CDFIs have a long history of lending. Generally, that lending history is very positive. In a lot of cases, much better than those of the financial institutions that they get funding from. And so I think that we need to find ways to leverage that historic positive, those historic positive outcomes in a way that is helpful to community. I haven't seen this done in any wide range industry way, but certainly it feels to me like there's some opportunity to leverage those decades of positive outcomes in terms of their lending to a way that will support the impact that we now see needs to happen in addition to the positive loan return.
That's really right, Sondra. And I think it speaks to, there is, to your earlier question, Andrea, it does feel like CDFIs have sort of been focused on building up our own balance sheets. And now there's a return to building a movement amongst CDFIs and emerging community funds.
And I would add as a last thought on the part on Paul's question about the de-risking, one practical aspect that we have seen, at least anecdotally, is as the project changes over time, there is a significantly less risk in navigating through that transition if there is already a pre-built level of trust and of community engagement. And the other is the effort by WISTA and others to redefine this notion of risk to really include the mission risk of many of these projects. Sure, there is the financial side, but also if we're true to the original mission of community development or mission-aligned investment, we can't leave aside the risk of not fulfilling what we set out to do on the impact side, or even having negative impacts with that. Great. I feel like we just scratched the surface a little bit. If you want to say one closing thing, or again, you all are too kind of modest and generous, and I keep asking you, like, how can we help you? How can people help you all? And so if you want to close on something like that, then we'll let you go. All right, Leslie, I'll call on you then. Give us a closing thought.
Everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think, so Olamina is coming up on our second year of lending. And, I think really what we've learned is that there's a tremendous opportunity to support more emerging CDFIs and loan funds, and really looking at how we can build the infrastructure to support these folks coming online. So that's something that we're kind of really thinking about. And I think one of the things, particularly from an investor's perspective, is really having longer terms. Kind of the 5 years is not going to get the work done that we need to have done. So we're really looking at, how can we invest for 7 to 10 years? And, and obviously having the lower rates is important, but also what we're seeing is really the need to be able to provide some runway capital and give, folks the 2 to 3 years that they need to get sustainable. So those are some of the things that, we're really thinking about as we're designing the next phase of our fund.
Yeah, I would say, I think that's all very true. And for folks that are thinking about maybe investing in community and grassroots funds, thinking about that from a blended capital perspective, that there's an investment opportunity here for sure, but all of this work of co-design and bringing community along is time. It's people's time, and that has a cost associated with it. So we've really invited our investors to think about where they can help to support those costs with some accompanying grants. We've been really grateful to investors like the Candide Foundation who've been able to do that.
And I'd just like to say, kind of in closing, that these kinds of forums I find incredibly helpful in meeting new people, Leslie and Nate, and seeing where our work intersects, and honestly getting new ideas and thoughts about things that we need to be thinking about or doing differently, or connections that we need to make. So thank you, Andrea, for bringing us together.
All right, thank you all, and thank you to all our guests as well. And I'll remind you for the next conversation that will be on August 12th. We'll be covering specifically grassroots community engagement in the context of real estate investment. So a lot of what we've talked about in the past was more on like enterprise financing. This will be on what's popping up in real estate. So thank you all for joining. Great conversation as always. Leslie, Nate, and Sondra, all the best, and keep up the great work. All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.